Good afternoon, Julian, and thank you very much for joining us to discuss the current situation of what has been called artificial intelligence. So maybe, Julian, could you start by telling your story of your personal involvement over the years in the various types of the development of artificial intelligence?
Yes, I don't claim to be a central player like Geoffrey Hinton in any way, but I have been very interested in artificial intelligence for decades. My early interest was from the point of view of ASR, automatic speech recognition, in other words, printing the words from that I would be saying, for instance. And also OCR, optical character recognition. In other words, he recognizes the writing. I think those were my principal interests from a very long time ago. And in the 90s, I managed to
How,
disappoint myself.
just out of interest, what sparked that interest? What was the situation or context? Can you
Um,
remember?
I no, I've always been interested in the spoken word and the written word, and I knew from early on that if you tried to transcribe something you recorded, it would take many, many hours. I even once did it as a sideline job professionally for a while, and it's pretty mind-numbing, and it's very long-winded and difficult. I used to say it takes at least 8 hours for every 1 hour of recorded speech, and it's probably longer than that. I don't think I was that quick, but you can get the idea. 8 to 10 to 1. It's so yeah. So that I think that's why it's a bit
You have
lost.
quite a diverse career background, haven't you? So
Uh, yes, yes, very strange. Yes, from science to music to film, pop videos, industrial films, medical films, Hollywood script doctor, then some academic career, at least in terms of getting masters and things like that. And quite late on, realizing that my worries about environment and concern for the state of the planet needed a lot more careful study. And that was during the 90s. It was quite difficult to get in back then. It wasn't like now, and which I think is a bit easier.
and so with all this background of being a sort of almost a Renaissance man, you got involved in OCR and speech recognition. And where did that then take you?
Well, I was just a user of it, and a very disappointed one too, let me say. I mean, it was always hopeless. It never worked very well. So I've been in the last few years with the advent of deep learning. Um, it was that was one of the main things that happened more than 10 years ago now, is that as neural nets and deep learning showed that you could recognize, well, it was handwriting, fonts, text. That was one of the major leaps forward with AlexNet. And then so yeah, so that rooted back to one of my early interests, and then automatic speech recognition. So we're now much better at recognizing speech, although still has some way to go in the sense that there's something called diarization, which is a profoundly silly word in my opinion. It just means it can tell me from you and from another person, and that's still not very brilliant yet. But
So
so there's
what
still
was
some way to go.
so you were a user, a disappointed user early
Yes.
on. At what point did you move from being, I suppose, a disappointed user to a more sort of engaged creator, if you like?
I think I mean I've been I started using ASR, speech recognition, several years ago. And there were some open source ones which were quite good, especially deep speech from Mozilla, which they, in my opinion, mistakenly axed. But really, the moment of takeoff was the same moment as for many other people, and that was sort of November. I guess it's 2022 now. The moment of, I've got that right, or was it 2023? The moment of ChatGPT 3.5, which is at the end of November. And I, with some other people who look, I found out very, very quickly. I think it was if it wasn't within hours, then it was within days. I started using it, and it was it was practically magic. Anyway, that app had one of the fastest takeoffs of any app in history. Very quickly got to 1 million and then 100 million users, and I could totally see why. And then it got better, and then there was a leap to GPT-4, which was a big leap, and then it was a long time before we got to GPT-5, which was another, I think, bigger leap than people realize. And now at the moment we're on GPT 5.4, which is a pretty good model. Pretty good model. So when I found it, and it was able to answer questions, and very quickly I discovered, along with many others, that it would really enable coding. It really helped coding quite a lot. It was plenty problematic. It was still quite a hard drudge. That's only really changed, quite honestly, I would say, absolutely seriously in the last 6 weeks, perhaps a bit more, but with the arrival of something called Opus 4.6, which is one of the Anthropic Claude models, that was suddenly in a new world. And it is able to code so well that I think you really need to not spend very much time with the actual lines of code and more shaping the whole thing. So you're much more a conductor than you are having to go around checking the tuning of the violas and you first violin, you played a wrong note over there. We have to go back and redo the recording. There's almost none of that now.
So what was because as I understand it, you're not a sort of average, you're a more expert user and a more engaged with it. So how did this use fit into what you were trying to do or what you were trying to achieve in life?
Well, so I write a lot of software for apps which I need and also that I want to launch, but there are many things that I just need to do, including helping with research, also helping other people, like my wife, who has needs. She was for quite a while a prospect researcher, and if you're faced with, say, a list of 2,000 companies and you've got to find out which of the people in the C-suite are most likely to give your charity some money, be it Oxford University or wherever else, then actually AI is still not very good at that on its own because it doesn't like having 2,000 X thrown at it. So what you have to do is break it up into 2,000 tranches, or perhaps slightly smaller, but it's still easiest. And then say, okay, look up this company or look up this person and then find their affinity. Are they likely to give and so forth? And it's much better to do that one by one. But if you do that 2,000 times over, that's a very tough thing for a human to do. So I wrote software which would help do that. And I also used open models which would run on our own local system, so wasn't the problem. Although this is all public information, it wouldn't have mattered a jot. But I always like to be pretty careful about this. So if you send it to your own model, it's effectively air gapped. I mean, not quite, but it's not going to go out onto the wild cloud. So you've got much more control over it. And I'm very interested in managing to, and we'll speak about this later, no doubt, managing to run as much of the inference of the compute as locally as you possibly can. And I think that will play into later questions that we'll have in other areas in possibly surprising ways.
So how would you describe yourself? Are you a sort of super user, super nerd, sort of, if you think there's someone who just uses it a bit randomly here and now, versus, I mean, you're not actually working, are you specifically? You're not obviously employed by an AI company or
No.
whatever, but you're, I suppose, a much more intelligent user. Not everyone can develop software, obviously.
No, I mean, increasingly people will be able to. I still think you'll need some kind of software background to do more serious and complex things, even as the AI gets better and better at it. But certain simple things, you could get it to do a poster website. You might be able to get it to do something more complex. You until it knows to go off and ask the security questions on its own. You could easily write something to give it a template to check for all the security issues and do what's called penetration testing, where you pretend to be a black hat hacker, somebody who has very bad intentions, and you deliberately attack your own site under your own control to see what's wrong with it, and then you harden it up. That probably takes a little bit more skill. You'd have to know to do that now, but I don't see any reason why that shouldn't be automated later on. So it's going to be interesting. I can't say for sure that in period of time X, nobody will need any programmers and software developers. And there are arguments that suggest we'll actually need more.
Let us now, Julian, talk about these opportunities which you've began to sort of enlarge on, but can you expand and maybe give a sort of a number of different areas where you think the opportunities are and that we can talk about?
In terms of using AI for what I would conceive as the betterment of life.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Okay. One of the problems is, as you've alluded to, and plenty of other people have, and I agree with, is that things do tend to be connected with many other things, and it is difficult to stay focused on one thing. I will try, when there are so many other threads without which things don't make sense. And this is a sort of a hermeneutics problem, but I will try. One can look at using AI in different realms and regions. And one can say, well, there's using AI personally, and then there's using AI in public, by which I mean governance. That's multiple meanings of public, but anyway, for governance. And then there's using it for corporate activities. Let's just turn, and I'll be as succinct as I can, that on the food front, it is clear, at least to me and at least to some others, that, and the numbers bear this out, that a very significant percentage of greenhouse gases are emitted by the food systems sector. Some say it's about 23%. It's a gigantic number. One. Two, it's very clear that we have taken enormous amounts of land from nature. So nature has very little left. Really, I think that's absolutely true to say. It's quite staggering what's been taken from nature. So anybody who's interested in biodiversity would want to see more land and good land being given back to nature. It's quite clear, if you're interested in climate change, we need to reduce the impact of the food sector. And one of the, possibly the only, but I think the simplest, although it's hard, the simplest way to do it is eat further down the food web. Further down the food chain, that means eating more plant-based. Now, for many people, this is anathema. It's absolutely a cursed idea and they won't even hear of it. But let's say for a minute that you feel like, oh, I get the arguments. I do see that I should eat more plant-based. The trouble is, one really loves meat and cheese and dairy and fish and all the rest of it. So how on earth am I going to do it? And let's say you're not the most gifted of cooks and you don't really understand that much about food, but your heart's in the right place and you'd really like to do better. This is one of the places where AI is going to be, frankly, your savior. Because AI understands these arguments, it has access to vast amounts of information, and it is already being used by many people for recipes. And it can come up with some remarkably good recipes. And if you say, well, that sounds absolutely great, but I'm a lousy cook, can you simplify it a bit? It will. It could, if it doesn't know this already, it could easily be told in a one-sentence memory that it will always remember. And by the way, in order that I don't feel too badly missing out on all my meats and all the rest of it, please make it as tasty as possible, even whilst you're making it nutritious. And that's quite difficult. AI will help with that. It will know nice balances of herbs and ingredients so that we don't get the inevitable, oh, it's just an overcooked mushroom burger or that kind of thing. That it's really subtle, and it will know many of the things that you need to know. It's highly skilled, in my opinion. You need a lot of skill and knowledge to prepare a really good, nutritious, interesting plant-based dish that will be so good that you'll say, oh, actually, I'll have that over the steak. So I think
So
that's going to be
that's
huge.
interesting. So there's a maybe a class of situations where people who wanted to reduce their environmental impact in various different situations. I suppose if you're a gardener, they could come up and design your garden to have a most to be best for
Yes.
biodiversity, etc., and tell you where to get plants and etc. I mean, there could be a load of other things like that. So is
Yeah.
that would you be able to say that is one sort of area of opportunity, if you like,
Yes.
a sort of
Yeah. Tremendously important. Tremendously important. And I ought to say here, since robots are coming in now, there are pre-orders on domestic robots now. The Chinese, as usual, in so many of these things are way ahead. Um, People are going to be frightened of robots, and there's going to be all kinds of negative things about them, and we're going to hear all the worst stories that you can imagine. But just to think, come back to it again. Let's say you're not a very good cook, or you're disabled, whatever it is, or you're just exhausted because you've had to work some stupid 12-hour a day, dead end job, and yet you still want to eat better and more healthily and help better for nature. Robots are being worked on very hard to cook better. And one of the reasons they can do that, in fact, the main reason is AI. What's so if you can imagine that, I mean, you've got a bunch of people that don't really have the knowledge, the robot does. And another thing that's very important is it's undoubtedly, I think anyway, I haven't done a study on this, but it's probably more expensive to eat plant-based in a really healthy, very exciting way. But AI could help you do it for at least a lower amount of money. I don't think you're going to beat some wretched McDonald's burger, but at least a smaller amount of money, and yet still have very high quality and ideally more local food, which is helping local artisanal farmers and so forth. This is not trivial. Requires a huge amount of knowledge and skill, and this is exactly what AI, especially when paired with robots. AI can already do it. Robots, it's coming in, it's starting this year very clearly, can really
so
help this.
in a way we'd all have our own Jamie Oliver who would be able to
Yes,
do a
we will.
£5 meal. You know, brilliant. So let's assume there are a number of cases like that in
Hmm.
different areas of expertise with reduced environmental impact. What other sort of domains do you think? Maybe more in that sort of governance, more in the public than the
Right, right. So the personal one is profound because there are so many humans and many of them might be feeling very frustrated. And that will definitely help them, no question. And it already is. Now, in terms of governance, this is equally, I don't want to judge them against each other, staggeringly important. Why? Basically, ever since the first agricultural revolution, which sort of began with the beginning of the Holocene about 11,700 years ago, when we began this whole agricultural system, which we depend on so deeply, we have made more and more and more complex systems. Not just agricultural, but then we have layers of governance and everything gets more and more complicated. So now we have a staggeringly complex world. No human, and more importantly, no group of humans can get close to understanding what the heck is going on. And yet, in order to make progress and reverse the direction, we're almost entirely going in the wrong direction on almost every metric and every way you can think of. We're going in the wrong direction. In order to do that, you need systems which can understand and make sense of millions, billions, even trillions of data points in order that you don't make yet another well-meaning bad decision, which has some horrible effect over here.
So can you give a sort of concrete example of how that might play out and where AI would come in on a sort of governance public
Yeah,
sort
well,
of,
that's exactly what I'm coming to.
yeah.
AI is the only thing which can deal simultaneously with millions and billions and trillions of intersecting, interleaving data points. So if we do not use AI in terms of these grand governance problems, I don't think there's a hope in hell of coming up with some better decisions. So that is probably the biggest use is we've got to use it to start making better, big decisions, understanding at a systems level.
So can you take a particular domain of decision making, or put this into a practical how that might play out?
Um,
Who are the people, I suppose, who are these people who are getting together in a group? Are they any particular, are they existing ones? Is it that councils might use them, I guess, or what? I mean, where
every layer of governance. So you could come back to I was trying to find a different one from food. Um, okay, for instance, they're looking at energy, something I've been writing on for 25 or so years. Um, it's very easy. You can come up with an idea. A classic one, which sounds very attractive on the face of it, is hydrogen, for instance. And yet, as soon as you look into hydrogen, which I still get excited about because everybody can make hydrogen in their kitchen sink, right? You need a cup, a little tiny bit of salt, and a battery, and you can make hydrogen right there. So, I mean, what could be simpler than that? But it turns out when you make it at scale, there are difficulties. So we could, for instance, use AI to improve the actual electrochemical aspect of it. Then that leads us to grid. Now, the electrical grid is very complex, and trying to balance that, and so that when a small number of solar panels, or let's say your hydrogen grid storage station comes on, which is slightly larger. We all know that those who are usually on the right and from the oil and gas lobbies will always say, "Oh, it's unstable, it's intermittent, you'll upset the grid, we haven't got the interconnectors." There's a whole long list of things, and it is unquestionably much more complicated. If you've got one point source 2 gigawatt nuclear reactor, that's much easier to deal with than a bunch of things going up and down. Mr. Jones comes on with his 2 kilowatts here for 5 minutes and so forth. So this is again the same kind of thing where AI is designed to cope with millions, billions, trillions of data points. They can also manage the demand as well, even if they can either detect it or manage it, depending on whether people want to let it. That is the kind of thing that only AI has a prayer of dealing with. So there is a gigantic opportunity there for AI to help manage this highly complex electrical grid and to help fend off some of the naysayers who just want us to be on more natural gas or more nuclear, when really I think we should be trying to go as 100% renewable as we can. But we can't do it without this grid management and, of course, grid storage, which we can come on to as another example of needing AI.
and actually, I suppose that here data centers themselves are finding it difficult in terms of getting on and being major users, all that sort of thing. So it's highly
Yes.
so that is, I suppose, a situation where I suppose AI could be directly controlling things because it's quite a hard controlled system, and presumably you don't need people, or people wouldn't be a major, you're pushing switches, etc. Could we take an example, which isn't quite food, but different, like landscape regeneration?
Hmm.
Um, so there you've got a situation where you've got a range of different landowners, and you've got the problem of climate change and increased rainfall, all these sorts of things. And then you've got various assets that are at risk in an area of increased flooding and disruption, all those sorts of things. Is that a sort of problem that AI would help you?
Another perfect example. Almost anything you can point to that's complex, with lots of moving parts, and also with humans involved who have ego and their own desires, and no matter how much they want to be unselfish, we're humans. So, perfect example. You've got the already immense complexities of weather, terroir, soil, land use. Then there's all all of nature, which doesn't usually have a voice. Maybe we could include them. We could have a sort of we could have a badger AI and or a badger agent, let's say, and the vole agent and so forth. So we can using AI not just model, but in real time help balance these competing uses and needs, and it was much easier for AI to say, oh, well, if we satisfy this group of humans over here, this other group of humans will be very unsatisfied. And by the way, the beavers will all be put out of business. Because it turns out that there's this, and this, and there's all these interconnections. Because surely most people who care are fed up with unintended consequences. Because that's what keeps happening almost every time. I mean, God forbid we start messing around with geo-environmental things and, putting 10 million strips of aluminium in the atmosphere to reflect the sun. Goodness knows what would happen. I've just made that one up, but you get the
Yeah,
idea.
yeah.
Goodness knows. Or so, yes, I think a super example, anything that's complex with lots of competing things, and you've got lots of people with agency, because the animals have agency too. So then it's very good at dealing with that. And I do want to inject in this very important idea. One of the reasons why AI is going to be so necessary is it doesn't have ego. It doesn't have consciousness. It doesn't care about itself. I mean, you might be able to program it to, but in and of itself, it doesn't care about itself. So it can then care about trying to balance all these other things without saying, oh, well, wait a minute, I'm going to be out of a job. The AI doesn't think like that. It doesn't care about itself.
Okay, so caring's quite a nice segue to, I think, the risk side of the ledger, if you like, because I suppose it's always the case, isn't it, with new technology? It can be used for positive things, for gain or ill. What are the risks do you see, particularly in the time where we're seeing the Google, YouTube, etc., being accused of addictive design and things like this.
Yeah.
Where do the risks come from then?
No, there are plenty of risks. There's I mean, one of the so-called godfathers of AI, Geoffrey Hinton, certainly doesn't play down the risks, and neither would I. Um, I think we need to be as alert to as many of them as possible. Some of the risks we've already seen is you can use AI as a recommender to reinforce bad behavior. But at the same time, you could use it to try and fend off by recognizing that. There are the obvious risks just in terms of the embodied, different meaning of embodied AI as embodied in all the chips that it uses, the sort of the heavy AI argument. Yes, we know about the data centers. They're causing all kinds of problems, including desire for water and power. Um, they're getting put in places where people don't necessarily want them. Um, there's also the distortion now of the chip market. For instance, there's a huge run up in RAM prices because so much memory is being diverted into data centers, so that anybody wants to have a more humble computer now is having to pay a lot more for RAM. There are the militarization of it. We see this going on in the US, but we're going to see it in other places too. There'll be militarized robots. There's militarized AI, there's face recognition. Chinese are very big on this, but you can bet that the Britain and other places will want to use it too. There are definitely legions of risk. You see it being used to reinforces bad behavior up to and including the incredibly sad suicides, especially of young people, but it's sad anyway. Um,
So yeah, I mean, actually, I suppose the dystopia tends to get more coverage, doesn't it? And I suppose the link there is to, I suppose, the question of who controls it. And we have maybe, possibly two. Let's just say there were two futures: one dystopic, called right, a surveillance state used to control people, particularly, I
yes.
suppose, people who've
Yeah.
lost their jobs and are dissatisfied, etc. And use it for violence, etc., etc. On the other hand, as you said, there's lots of very challenging problems we face, which that sort of intelligence might well help us with. What are going to be the determinants, you think, of which road we go down?
Okay, well, one of the things that I think is important to realize there are going to be multiple roads as multiple layers. I don't think that we'll necessarily go down just one single road. It's much more, it's always nearly always much more complex than that. And we'll see this playing out, I think, in some of your other questions coming down the pike about the AI bubble. Um, so there isn't one particular path that I think we're going to go down. But so we're going to need to be aware. And I think this is one of the things that people are going to need to be much more aware of what's going on. And AI, again, can help with that. Would you mind just re-asking the question?
Okay, we'll go back. Yes, what I was thinking is, this technology can be used for good or ill, I think. And I suppose, what are the factors to mean it's more used for good than ill?
So the fact that we can go down multiple roads means that there will still be opportunities, even if we find ourselves, or quite a lot of people going down some of the bad roads, there will be opportunities to go down some of the good roads. And again, AI will help people get the information they not only get the information they need, because AI has helped an awful lot with, for instance, web search. Many of us have had the experience of endlessly searching on Google and just not finding it. AI really helps with that. It pulls out the nuggets of gold, which might be buried on page 100, or indeed just sort of sprinkled all over the first 10 pages, and you just give up thinking it's not there, and it is there. So the direct answer to your question is using AI will help us to understand better how to find those better roads, and part of that will be the more that we can run AI locally. So then this comes to your control question. Inevitably, the big tech companies in Silicon Valley have got control over the AI if you keep having to send all your prompts to effectively Silicon Valley, right? So then they keep control, and they can monitor it, and they can see what you're asking, and they can see what's coming back, and they also can, when they charge enough money for it, they can also make a lot of money out of that. Much more difficult for them if you are sending it to a local model on your phone or on your computer, and it never gets out of your computer. Let's assume that people aren't leeching it out deliberately, but again, you'll be able to use AI more to help protect yourself against that. I hope that at least some people will begin to see that AI can be their greatest friend. In the hands of certain ghastly actors, of which there are plenty, it might well become the greatest enemy.
Yes, I'm very interested in that, because I became aware of this ability to have AI models on your own computer, though I tried to do it and it just slowed my computer down so much, etc. So where is that going, and how much are people becoming more aware of local AI models?
Well, people who sort of live and swim in it as I do are certainly highly aware, and indeed I built myself a rig which be slightly beyond as well. I don't want to say a normal person, but most people don't go around spending 2.5 grand and building themselves a custom rig with much more processing power, let's say graphics processing power, which is what we need for the AI processing than normal. That was 2.5 years ago, and it's still tremendously useful. It can run models that other people can't run, and it doesn't slow down in the way that you said. However, what's coming to help you is something called, there are a number of things, but one of the clearest things is quantization, in which you by very clever techniques, you slim down the, as it were, the footprint on your computer, so that a smaller and smaller computer can run a more and more powerful model without losing very much of the quality, the excellence of the inference of the answer. by techniques that are being developed, and they've been underway for some time. There is a very good reason why people try to do this. Even OpenAI wants to do this. In fact, their most recent model is significantly faster because it uses significantly less tokens because they are finding ways to reduce the amount of compute that it takes. So all of that leads towards more powerful models running more and more locally, including on your cell phone.
I wonder, I mean, it's sort of interesting this that so the picture I think you're painting is that there's the vanilla, the stuff we know about, which
Hmm.
potentially could be used surveillance, and of course, do we trust these guys? Like Grok is apparently sort of controlled ultimately by what Elon Musk believes, etc. With a sort of counter, almost as a rebel movement of people actually trying to take individual control or whatever. But presumably the big players who are trying to control things, and if we're moving more of a surveillance states, will try and stop people opting out and being independent and protecting themselves from this source of power, weren't they?
That ship has absolutely sailed, thank goodness. There's no way to do that now. And this is partly thanks to the Chinese. Not You don't always think of China as being very helpful towards sort of democracy and the democratization of knowledge. But they have been. They are now producing smaller and smaller models. There's a model called Quen 3.5, and that will run on tiny resources. It will probably even run well on your computer. It won't give you ChatGPT level of answers. It's not like speaking to a brilliant PhD student, which frankly it is when you're talking to Claude or GPT, but it will at lower levels. It will give you simpler answers, which will answer many kinds of questions, and they can do classification quite well, which is a very important function. So that ship has sailed. There is no way, even if Elon Musk wanted to, or Peter Thiel or Donald Trump, even if they wanted to stop you doing it, even now in March 2026, it's far too late. There are already enough good models out there freely available that you can just download like that in probably in a matter of 10 seconds, and you could find them extremely easily, again with the help of AI, and they can be remarkably helpful to you, especially if you know a little bit about how to harness them into systems. So they cannot stop that.
And so is this a sort of open source? This is the open source movement, is it?
I'm a little careful about the word open source. I think it's better to call them open models. And all I mean by that is um, to get a fully open source large language model, you would also need to have access to all the training material. And unless that is fully open itself, like Wiki Commons or something like that, and in order to get enough, it's reckoned that you need somewhere between 15 trillion and 30 trillion tokens, and it's very hard to get that all from the open systems. So if you wanted a completely open model, you would have to open that as well, right? So if you've paid let's say $5 billion for access to all this stuff, you can't just then open that. Even if you wanted to, you can't. You would be breaking all kinds of agreements and you would have wasted your $5 billion, whatever it is. So
Okay.
I just want to be careful about that. But there are important aspects about these things which are open. The weights are open. Increasingly, other things about them are open, and you can download them from the web now for free and run them for free on your local devices.
And are they going to keep developing these? I mean, who
Oh
are the
yeah,
people who are giving all their time to developing these things and why?
mostly the Chinese.
And why is that? How is this happening in China?
That is something that's on my. In order to give you a good informed answer, I couldn't do it exactly now. I could give you what I think is the answer, but it's on my research list. It's very complex what's gone on there, and it's very unlikely in one way, but in another way, it's not so unlikely. And I think this is an incredibly important point for people to understand. And it's not just AI; is that China is an engineering state. Whereas the US, for instance, is a legalistic state. It's a state of laws. You might think it's a bit lawless now, but it's semi-run or even more completely run by lawyers, whereas China is literally run by engineers. About half the Politburo are engineers. And whatever you think of that system, the fact that you've got people, makers, these are, let's leave the word engineers to one side, makers, which I think is something so incredibly important. The Chinese, large numbers of the Chinese people see themselves as makers. And sadly, in the West, especially in Britain, we no longer see ourselves as makers, which I think is hugely problematic mentally. And it's also very problematic for us as human beings because we are technological. We are Homo technicus, and we have been for probably a million or more years. And so that's one of the huge advantages. So Chinese make things, and now they see this is AI is so important. So it's almost natural for them to want to make AI.
Well, this might takes us quite nicely to what might happen around the crash. And in particular, are the sort of open, well, the Chinese models, etc., more likely to survive? And what's going to happen to, what's the shakeout going to do? Who are going to be the losers and who are going to be the winners?
I think shakeout is a much better word than crash. And the reason I'll come on to winners and losers in a second, but I think this is tremendously important because you allude to crash, and plenty of other people do, including in the financial community. But it's much more complicated than that. This is not, I think, going to be a dot bomb, and it's not going to be a GFC, as we saw in 2007, 2008, a global financial crisis, where there were a number of drivers, but there was a pretty clear path to that disaster. Whereas where we are now, it's very multi-layered. There's at least half a dozen complex, powerful layers, and they are very, very unlikely to all go down at the same time or all fall apart at the same time. So if somebody is trying to do a Michael Burry and bet on a sudden collapse of the housing market, I think they are probably going to lose their money. So what's going to happen is much more, as you said, a shakeout. There will be people who do better than expected, people who do worse than expected, because there are all these different layers. Some of the layers are, for instance, there's all that capex, the capital expenditure and investment that's going into data centers. Now, we've already spoken about pushing some of this compute into local models. If you imagine there are enough breakthroughs, and there are maybe other reasons too, which a lot of people start saying, oh, I can do this compute on my local machine, and I don't have to pay $20 or $200 or whatever it is to the OpenAIs and the Anthropics for this. I can do it locally, and I'm already paying my phone bill. It's not going to cost me any more anyway. If that happened at scale, I'm not saying it will, but I'm not saying it won't. If that happened at scale, that will be one reason that would leave a lot of these data centers as stranded assets. So that's a possibility. There's also there are other areas in which that money and effort has been put in that might not go very well, or there might be, for instance, if there is another pandemic, or let's say the Iran war goes on for longer, right? No one can say that can't happen. And then it caused, with high energy prices and the lack of helium and so forth, and the difficulties with natural gas and all that, it's quite possible we can have another global recession. Could it be as bad as the GFC? I don't know. But that would squelch demand for a lot of services, and that would also have an impact on this, and that could cause a crash. But then, because of the locality of AI, you might find some other new players coming in there who suddenly could do very well because some of the larger players had been reduced. And that is also brings me to a very important point. Unlike some of the other crashes, there is absolutely no question that AI is providing incredibly valuable services that a lot of humans want. The rise of ChatGPT is absolute proof, and it hasn't gone away. I think they say, may have the number wrong, 800 million users. I'm a very heavy user of it because it does such incredible work for me, 10, 14 hours a day, that I don't know what I'd do without it. It's so tremendous what it can do at its best.
I suppose the big question is, what is the successful business model? Because presumably that everyone's losing loads, and is it that some are going to outlast? They've got more financial backing, so and then they can develop a business model that works, which might mean that they start charging a lot more because they're losing on. I imagine, Julian, you're probably responsible for huge losses in the AI businesses, and
Not always, not
yeah,
always.
because
I,
the cost, you're using them at a price which is much lower than the actual costs they're bearing to supply the services that you're looking for.
Yeah, well, sometimes I am, and sometimes, I mean, 2 weeks ago, I was definitely helping line their pockets. Then something happened a couple of weeks ago. A new model came out, which is temporarily free and very powerful, and I jumped on that, and it had a pleasingly revolutionary effect on our bank account. But yes, your point definitely stands. I think there's little doubt that this is being supported by enormous amounts of VC money, investment money going in, and some of that's going to go wrong. It always does with VC money. Um, yes, I think some undoubtedly. I mean, it's almost banal to say it. Some of the organizations and companies will survive. Some will be, and some won't. Some will be surprising. Some won't. I think one of the surprises is the way Google's gone from a very bad position. Well, it was amazing. I mean, they published the original attention paper, which made it possible for transformers to be developed. Then they fell behind. Bard was a disaster. Gemini wasn't much better in its early days. It's gotten quite a lot better since then. And it looked like Google was out of the game almost. But now, if you look at it, Google is many people are putting some of their best bets on Google. And some people will say, well, actually, it's Anthropic that'll be, I mean, it'll be OpenAI that's in trouble. I think it's much too early to say who the winners and losers will be. We don't know what tremendous breakthroughs there might be. They're happening all the time. Nobody, or very few people, predicted the entrance of the Chinese with DeepSeek, and I would also mention Moonshot and others into that. That was not predicted just before January last year. So yes, there will be winners and losers. Trying to predict who they are is very difficult.
And you think actually one of the winners could be more the local models that are currently less well known, if you like, do you think?
Yes, they will certainly carry on existing because you can't really take them out of existence once they've come into existence. People will be able to use them. I mean, the bigger worry is that it will only be the tech giants, the Googles and the Alphabets of this world, who do well out of it. And I think people who say that as a worry have a good case to make. These companies are frankly far too powerful, and we do need a return to the era of the Roosevelt and Wilson, when they were trying to push back on monopolies with the antitrust movement and so on. There is a little bit of that. I don't think it's nearly powerful enough. I would like to see the big tech companies greatly reduced in their power, broken up, and power redistributed to others. There is a possibility with some of the Chinese, and hopefully one day maybe some Western open source models. There is one from OpenAI, but yeah, so there are some possibilities. I have to say at the moment, I do think the big seven and others are probably going to be some of the most likely winners, and I don't think that's so great. I would much rather see it being spread more widely. But that would take a lot of knowledge, and that will also take people who might be sort of flatly against AI. It would be much better if at least some of them said, hey, there are some opportunities here. And if we really want big tech not to just run away with this, then we ought to get more engaged because there are such huge benefits from it.
Well, this is the key question, isn't it? Can we get those benefits without them being turned into, um, problems? But obviously, a lot to go on, a lot to be seen. But thank you very much for a very interesting perspective, and let's hope that the good guys win.
Thank you very much, Henry.
Thank you.